Hello, namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. The Ukraine war is escalating and it's being fought on Russian territory now. Zelensky says he's giving Putin a taste of his medicine. But is he prepared for the consequences? What is this Ukrainian operation and what is it meant to achieve? We'll discuss all of that. In Bangladesh, as a week of political upheaval draws to a close, the plot twists continue. Now, Sheikh Hasina wants to return to Dhaka. We'll bring you the full story. The protesters said that they were fighting to save Bangladesh's democracy. They ended up wounding the economy in the process. And what is the law and order situation like? Hindus carried out a protest march today. We'll tell you about it. Further east, tensions between China and the Philippines are escalating. A special report on the Subi Reef coming up. In Iraq, the government wants to legalize marriage for 9-year-old girls. What gives? In Japan, the world's first earthquake warning. In the US, people are losing faith in democracy. We have some ideas on how the world can help. And is silence the new wellness trend? Also looking at Pakistan's first ever Olympic gold medal and the contest to claim credit for it. All this and more coming up. The headlines first. Israel agrees to resume Gaza truce talks next week. This comes as its troops begin a new operation in Khan Yunis. In April, Israel had withdrawn from the southern Gaza city. Since the war began in October, there has been only one truce, a week-long pause in November. Two Sri Lankan ministers sacked over defection. The Supreme Court upheld disciplinary action against them. The ministers defected from the opposition to back President Ranil Wickremesinghe. This comes ahead of presidential elections next month. It will be the first vote since the unprecedented economic crisis of 2022. Thailand's main opposition party relaunches with a new name and leader. The Move Forward Party is now the People's Party. It will be led by a 37-year-old tech entrepreneur. The party had won the popular vote in last year's election, but earlier this week it was forced by a court to disband. Samsung is recalling more than 1 million electric stoves in the US. This follows reports of accidental fires that injured people and killed pets. In 2016, Samsung's safety reputation had suffered a major blow. Its flagship Galaxy Note 7 smartphone was recalled over exploding batteries. And Botswana's president gives his country the afternoon off. Why? To celebrate its first Olympic gold. Botswana won gold in the men's 200 meters race. This is the first time an African has won the event at the Olympics. The war in Ukraine is back in focus. For months, the front lines were frozen, but this week, a fresh round of fighting has broken out with a twist. The war has shifted to Russia. Ukraine has breached Russian borders. Zelensky has taken the fight into Russian territory. He says the Russians should feel the war. His operation began 4 days ago, and now Kyiv says Russian troops are surrendering. This video is from the Kursk region. It's in western Russia. It shares a border with Ukraine. Earlier this week, Ukrainian forces crossed into this region. There were some 1,000 troops here. Reports say they were all well equipped. They had Western armored vehicles, artillery, tanks and drones, and they're said to be fighting in multiple Russian villages in this region now. These are Ukrainian troops on the offensive on Russian land. In fact, Kyiv has leaked some details about the operation, mostly to the Western press. Here is what they claim. Ukraine has seized about 100 square kilometers in Kursk. They've captured a gas metering station. This is used for Russia's energy supply to European countries like Hungary and Slovakia, and Ukraine is targeting this infrastructure. It also claims to have taken hundreds of prisoners. Remember, these are all Ukrainian claims. No one has been able to independently verify them. But some videos have emerged. They show a destroyed Russian military convoy. Russian authorities are trying to evacuate the locals, but it is proving to be a challenge. President Vladimir Putin has declared a state of emergency. He spoke to the governor of Kursk.
We started moving people out. It was quite difficult because these Ukrainian diversion groups are shelling the civilian population.
Please, together with your colleagues from various agencies, including the Ministry of Emergency Situations, this compensation work will have to be done. Meaning loss of property, loss of housing too, on a full scale. We will have to do it all.
Putin's troubles escalated today. Ukraine has broadened its campaign. Ukrainian drones struck the city of Lipetsk. Again, this is a Russian city in the west. It's about 400 kilometers from Kursk, and the fighting is on here. The Ukrainian drones targeted a Russian airfield. They bombed ammunition warehouses. So Ukraine is ramping up its attacks on Russia. Earlier, such operations used to be undercover. Ukraine never took responsibility or showed direct engagement. But that is not the case anymore.
Everyone can see that the Ukrainian army knows how to surprise and knows how to achieve results. This is demonstrated by the battlefield, where our soldiers not only withstood the overwhelming force of the occupiers, but also are destroying it in the way necessary to protect Ukraine, our state and independence.
Zelensky is not even pretending to keep this a secret now, which shows a clear shift in Ukraine's approach. Earlier, they followed the policy of plausible deniability. Their operations were tactical and discreet. Their teams were smaller, often made up of special forces or local sympathizers. Russia labeled such elements as saboteurs. They were the ones who carried out the attacks, mostly sporadic. What you have now is a sustained wave of strikes, with Kyiv not shying away from showing direct involvement. It's a bolder, even provocative approach. Ukraine has sent a large number of troops into Russia. They're heavily armed, and they're engaged in days-long battles against Russian forces. This is a high-risk mission. How does it help Kyiv, though? For starters, these attacks could distract the Russian military, force them to shift focus away from the fighting in Ukraine and towards defending Russian territory. That could be one objective that would help Kyiv, but perhaps they have a bigger prize in mind. If Ukraine manages to take control of some parts of Kursk, it will get some much-needed leverage over Moscow. In fact, one of Zelensky's advisors hinted at this. He suggested that this could be the only way to push Russia towards a negotiation.
Escalation is exclusively what the Russian Federation is doing. Everything that Ukraine does is an attempt to get to just peace. Russia will not react to any proposals before it receives appropriate, aggressive retaliatory strikes.
It's a risky gamble, one that will come with consequences, like a Russian reprisal. In fact, it's already begun. Russian forces are striking more targets in Ukraine. Today, they bombed a supermarket in eastern Ukraine. At least 10 people were killed. And if the Ukrainian operation continues in Kursk, these attacks from Russia will only increase. So the question here is, how long will Kyiv run this operation? And the numbers are not in their favor. Russia has more troops, it has more military equipment. Kyiv is completely dependent on Western partners, and it cannot take that support for granted. Germany, for one, plans to slash military aid. The US can go either way, depending on the election result. So success on the battlefield may help Zelensky's case. It may help him persuade the West to continue funding this war. But he needs to show results quickly, and time is not on his side. Also, the lives of his people hang in the balance. Let's turn to India now, which is hosting the most high-profile refugee in the world. at least for now. I'm talking about Sheikh Hasina. She's been here for 5 days now, so naturally questions are being asked on how much longer will she stay and where will she go next. Well, Hasina's son has dropped a bombshell statement. He says Sheikh Hasina has not applied for asylum anywhere, not in the UK, not in Finland, and not in West Asia. That's what he says. She's not going anywhere. Instead, she plans to return to Bangladesh. I know it sounds ludicrous. Protesters literally stormed her house on Monday. They're toppling her father's statues everywhere. Her party leaders are being lynched. So how can Sheikh Hasina return home? Well, the logistics are not clear yet, but her son says that she will return once elections are called. As a strategy, honestly, it makes no sense. Lawyers in Bangladesh are already planning legal cases. They want India to arrest and extradite Hasina. So what happens if she willingly returns? What will happen? At best, she will be arrested. At worst, let's not even go there. It's also a U-turn for Hasina's family. Her son was saying something very different on Monday. He said Sheikh Hasina wanted nothing more to do with Bangladesh. Then on Wednesday, he changed his tune. He said Hasina cannot abandon Bangladesh, and now he says she plans to return.
What will happen to you after post-Sheikh Hasina regime? It is none of my concern, nor my family's anymore. You will realize. I had said my family will no longer be involved in politics, but the way our party leaders and workers are being attacked, we cannot give up.
Maybe the family knows something that we don't, or maybe it's just wishful thinking. Either way, it is a concern for India. You see, India doesn't have an official refugee policy. So Hasina's status is ambiguous. The government doesn't have any rules to follow. It's all very ad hoc. But a bigger concern is the politics. India is clearly looking to engage with the interim government in Dhaka. Prime Minister Modi congratulated Mohammad Yunus. The Indian High Commissioner also attended his swearing-in yesterday. So New Delhi is looking ahead. But what if the interim government wants Sheikh Hasina back, not to rule but to prosecute? What if they ask for her? Then things could get complicated. The BNP, or the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, is already talking about this. Listen to what their senior leader said, and I'm quoting, "The BNP believes that Bangladesh and India should have cooperation. However, supporting our adversaries complicates the maintenance of that cooperation." It's a clear message to India. Stop supporting Sheikh Hasina. And Mohammad Yunus also sent a similar message. He said he was hurt by India's reaction to the protest. Remember, India had called it an internal matter for Dhaka. But listen to what Mohammad Yunus said. This is his assessment. I'm quoting, "If there is a fire in the brother's house, how can I say it is an internal affair?" So the sentiment is quite clear. The new masters in Dhaka are not quite fond of India. So what can India do? We saw New Delhi's reaction to the Maldivian pivot. Their new president expelled Indian soldiers. He said India out. But New Delhi handled it with grace and, more importantly, with patience. Having said that, time is of the essence because other countries are also watching this closely. Countries like China and Pakistan. Now, we know India was Sheikh Hasina's top ally, but the new regime may want a new ally. So let's look at the contenders. First is Pakistan. Their defense minister is celebrating Sheikh Hasina's ouster. He says she led an India-backed government. He also said it's a great chance to reset Pakistan-Bangladesh ties, sort of like a fresh start. Now, Yunus may not engage Pakistan as much. He's almost 84 years old. He must remember the trauma of liberation. But Mohammad Yunus is only a caretaker. We don't know what elections will bring. From all accounts, the Jamaat-e-Islami has made giant strides in Bangladesh, so they could play a key role in the next government. And the Jamaat has long had ties with the ISI. That's the Inter-Services Intelligence, Pakistan spy agency. So this political churn suits Islamabad very well. Which brings us to the second contender, China. Their response has been very measured. You see, Beijing did not mind Sheikh Hasina's rule. Yes, she was pro-India, but she never really acted against China's interest. Bilateral trade hit new records. Chinese investments flowed in, so Beijing was more than happy to engage with Hasina. Even during the protests, They did not take sides. They called it an internal affair, just like India did. But unlike India, China is also close to the opposition in Dhaka. In 2016, Xi Jinping had travelled to Bangladesh. He held a meeting with Khalida Zia, the leader of the BNP. Plus, China doesn't care about ideology. Jamaat, Taliban, junta, it's all the same for them. They will do business with any regime in Dhaka. Their only concern will be instability. China has dozens of infrastructure projects in Bangladesh, meaning they have money tied up there, and instability is never good for business. But beyond that, this regime change is just an opportunity for Beijing to turn an Indian ally into an Indian rival. What would this regime change mean for the people of Bangladesh? It depends on how the new dispensation manages their affairs. Right now, it's a toss-up. There's political uncertainty, and that is hurting their economy, which should be a big worry for Bangladesh because economy is what they were getting right. This country was among the fastest growing economies in the world, and now it is in a chaos which could undo decades of progress. Trade has already been disrupted. Yesterday, there was a long line of trucks waiting to cross into Bangladesh. This is a checkpoint at the North 24 Parganas in the Indian state of West Bengal. This route connects West Bengal to Benapole in Bangladesh. 30% of India's land trade with Bangladesh happens through this border. And Bangladesh imports all kinds of goods from India, from cotton to food supplies like onion and even crude oil. But the events of this week have hampered supplies. The situation has improved in the last 24 hours. Some of the border checkpoints have opened up again, but the disruption has been significant. There have been large-scale losses to the Bangladeshi economy. Take the garment industry, for instance. Garments are the biggest export of Bangladesh. They make up 90% of all exports. The protests and violence hit the garment industry. They had to stop production for several days. The factories had to be shut. They came back online just 2 days ago.
During this ongoing movement, the factories were fully closed for 6 days. We faced huge loss in these days. We lost 228,000 pieces of production and $107,000 in this factory alone.
Bangladesh can ill afford such disruptions. It has bills to pay. Debt repayments are due. Bangladesh owes more than $100 billion. $100 billion, this is the external debt, the money that Dhaka owes to outside lenders. The political chaos has a direct bearing on the finances of the country. Over the past few weeks, they've lost more than $1 billion in foreign currency reserves. Regular trade and economic activity has been hit. Exports have fallen, so have the earnings. So how much money is left in the reserve now? We don't have an exact number. Last month, they had around $20 billion in the bank, which is just about enough to sustain them for 4 months. The economy is on shaky ground at the moment. It has been for a while, in fact. Last year, Dhaka sought help from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Dhaka needed help to shore up its reserves, and the IMF agreed. It extended a loan of $4.7 billion. And like most IMF loans, this one too came with strings attached. The IMF imposed some tough conditions on Dhaka. It was asked to meet certain economic benchmarks to keep receiving the money. And the progress is reviewed regularly. The last review happened this year in June, and the IMF was not too happy. It said Bangladesh was falling short of its commitments, so the IMF tightened the screws. It imposed 33 conditions on Dhaka. So Bangladesh has to fulfill these 33 conditions to get the next tranche of the loan. And what were these conditions? Well, most of them were about fixing the macroeconomic situation, like keeping inflation in check, boosting government revenue, better regulating the banking sector, and managing the debt more effectively, all of which are fairly reasonable demands for a stable government to meet. But Bangladesh no longer has that. It doesn't have a stable government. Can the interim government deliver here? Can they fix the finances? It is going to be tough. This financial crisis has been brewing for a while, like I said. The Sheikh Hasina government was trying to manage it. Last month, they also reached out to Beijing for help. They wanted a loan from China. Bangladesh wanted a loan. It asked for around $5 billion, but in the Chinese currency. Dhaka had asked for a yuan-denominated loan. Did China agree? We cannot confirm yet. We don't know what came of that request. But we can hazard a guess about the IMF's response going forward. They may not be inclined to give more money in a hurry. If the political uncertainty continues, the IMF may impose stricter terms, which puts Dhaka at risk. If they don't get a grip on the situation, they will lose more lenders. And they'll become more vulnerable to loan sharks like China. Beijing could rush in to help Dhaka and push it into a debt trap. You see, the protesters said they fought to save democracy, and they did manage to topple Sheikh Hasina. But who will save Bangladesh's economy now? That's the question they must dwell on. We have talked about Hasina's future. We've also looked at Bangladesh's economy. But how has life changed in the country? I know there's a lot of information on social media, and it's not always reliable. Half the people have an agenda to push there. The other half has old or fake videos. So we decided to find out ourselves. We've been trying to do that for the past few days. We've spoken to multiple sources in Bangladesh. We asked them about the situation on the ground. What do they see around them? And here's what we've learned. Law and order is the biggest problem. Nobody knows who is in charge of the situation. A lot of police stations were burnt, weapons were looted, so the officers are not showing up for duty. Meaning, the police stations are still empty. There's no one to register complaints, no proper patrolling on the streets, and no intelligence gathering. So residents have taken matters into their own hands. They're using lathis to guard their own property. But nights are the worst, because that's when miscreants try to take advantage, either by attacking minorities or by stealing or by settling personal scores. Since there are no cops, it's a free-for-all. Which brings us to the Hindu community. What is their status right now? Our sources say that Hindus and temples were attacked after Hasina's ouster. They were attacked, especially on Tuesday and Wednesday. We brought you some of those pictures. Those were not fake videos. The attacks on Hindus and temples did happen. But since Wednesday, the attacks have reduced. And I know this may sound confusing. Maybe your social media feed is still flooded by videos of such incidents. But we can tell you a lot of them are old videos. They're being recycled to spread fear. Today, the Hindu community held a protest in Dhaka. Hundreds of them gathered in the city. They asked the administration to protect them. Take a look at this. So what happens next? The army is on the job. They're looking to make the police stations functional again. But time is of the essence. Right now, there is a sense of the unknown, a sense of being rudderless. So a lot of people are looking to flee. Let me show you these pictures from the India-Bangladesh border. It's from the Cooch Behar region in West Bengal. A large group of Hindus gathered there to cross over. But India's border agency, the Border Security Force, pushed them back. We reported a similar incident yesterday as well. Around 500 people tried to enter India illegally. The border agency said it wasn't a Hindu exodus. They blamed this on local unrest. So from what we've gathered, there are two problems at the moment. One is a security vacuum. The people don't know who is in charge on the ground. And problem number two is trust deficit. The interim government has promised to protect minorities, but we haven't seen concrete actions yet. Hence, these attempts to flee the country. These next few days will be crucial for Bangladesh. We'll be tracking all the updates closely for you. Now let's shift our focus to Southeast Asia, to China and the Philippines, and the constant tension between them. Up till a few weeks ago, the two nations were clashing regularly. Chinese Coast Guard ships kept entering the West Philippine Sea. That's the area of the South China Sea, which belongs to the Philippines. Therefore, it's called the West Philippine Sea. But Beijing doesn't care much for borders. The Chinese Coast Guard was constantly violating Manila's territory. They kept obstructing and attacking Filipino ships, and it got so bad that a sailor lost his thumb. When the Chinese Coast Guard attacked his ship with knives and an axe, it was an act of barbarism. Tensions between Manila and Beijing were at their peak. But then, something unexpected happened.
Based on China's three-point principle positions on handling the current situation at the Second Thomas Shoal, the temporary arrangement with the Philippines on the delivery of humanitarian supplies reflects China's goodwill.
China and the Philippines negotiated a temporary deal. Manila could resupply its outpost in the Second Thomas Shoal, and China said it would not harass Filipino vessels. That was the deal, and that's why the clashes subsided. But remember, this is China we're talking about. Beijing isn't the type to renounce its bogus claims. It agreed to a temporary deal, but only at one disputed territory. Meanwhile, it's been busy at another part of the sea, the Subi Reef. This video emerged earlier this week. It shows the level of Chinese activity at Subi Reef. That's the Subi Reef. Look at all those buildings again. There's also a harbor at the back. There are hangars and a massive runway. All of this is at Subi Reef. And remember, this is an artificial island built on top of a low-lying atoll within the disputed Spratly Islands. The Spratly Islands are claimed by a number of countries. The Philippines, China, Taiwan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, all of them lay claim on some or all of these islands. And what does China do? It builds artificial areas like the Subi Reef and then militarizes them. The Philippines has in fact confirmed this. A spokesperson for the Filipino Navy gave an update this week. He said that the Subi Reef already has airstrips and harbors for warships. And we saw those in the video. It also has military-grade communications equipment. The Navy spokesperson added that China was putting up more structures on the island. Subi is not the first to get militarized, though. China has also built two other artificial island bases, Mischief Reef and Johnson Reef. Manila claims that these two fall inside Filipino territory. But China has put anti-aircraft and anti-missile guns on these islands. It has set up harbors and airstrips there. And Manila believes that they are being used as staging areas for Chinese activity in Filipino waters. Between July 30th and August 5th, 122 Chinese vessels were seen in the West Philippine Sea. 122 Chinese vessels. This was after the two nations signed the temporary de-escalation deal. So clearly, Beijing is not backing down. It is carrying on with its incursions. And what is Manila doing about this? Well, it is trying to find partners to help it counter the Chinese threat. The Philippines signed a defense agreement with Germany last weekend. It will allow for joint military training and the possible sale of German weapons to the Philippines. Yesterday, the Filipino Navy held drills with the US, Australia and Canada. It was a show of force in the disputed waters. Another set of drills began today. The first ever joint drills by the Filipino and Vietnamese Coast Guards. Remember, both these countries also have territorial disputes. But it seems they've decided to put their differences aside and counter China together. It's a good strategy. The Philippines is a small nation, but with enough partners, it may be able to give China pause. That may be the only way to get Beijing to back down and stop its militarization of the entire South China Sea, especially the parts that don't belong to it. Our next story is from Africa, from Kenya in the east. Kenya has been facing protests for weeks. The demonstrations were initially against new taxes that was part of Kenya's annual budget. People wanted the new taxes to be scrapped. Thousands took to the streets. They protested for days, and they eventually succeeded. Kenya's President William Ruto backed down. He did not implement the new taxes, so the demonstrators won. But some of them have not stopped protesting. They're still taking to the streets and demanding Ruto's resignation. But the Kenyan president has lost patience with the demonstrators, it seems, and his police force is now taking a heavy-handed approach. Here's our report.
Those were the scenes from Kenya yesterday, from the capital, Nairobi. People had taken to the streets once again to protest against Kenya's President William Ruto. Kenyans have been protesting since mid-June. But yesterday's demonstration was subdued, especially compared to the early days. This is what Nairobi looked like when the protests had begun. There were thousands on the streets. But yesterday the numbers were far lower. It shows just how much steam the protests have lost. What was also noticeable was the police response. Officers were seen marching in full force, firing tear gas at the small groups that had gathered.
It is very, very sad that we came here today. We have been tear gassed, people have been beaten, knife bullets have been thrown all over. It is not right. So our president should understand that we are not doing this for ourselves. We are doing this to save his soul, to save this country.
The police arrested 174 people across Kenya yesterday. They picked up 126 people in Nairobi alone. By the looks of it, the protesters are unlikely to make much headway in the future. The Kenyan protests began with a clear goal in mind. Young people initially took to the streets to demonstrate against new taxes. Ruto had proposed increasing taxes on basic goods like bread, diapers and sanitary napkins. This had infuriated the people, so they decided to protest. Eventually, they got Ruto to back down. He scrapped the new taxes, so most of the protesters got what they wanted. But by the time Ruto relented, a number of protesters had died. They were killed by the police while protesting. This angered some of their fellow demonstrators who came up with a new demand. You could hear one chant all over Kenya: Ruto must go. The people wanted the president gone, and Ruto was on the back foot. But he did everything he could to stay on as president. First, he scrapped the new taxes. Then he dismissed his entire cabinet. After that, he co-opted the political opposition, bringing his rivals into the cabinet and forming a unity government. That new cabinet was sworn in yesterday while the smaller protests were taking place.
I am persuaded that this moment in the life of our nation calls on us to build a strong team of rivals to give our transformation agenda the best chance of success and to enhance inclusivity in our national development.
The protesters have been marching for weeks, and at every turn they have been thwarted. The police are cracking down on the protesters harder than ever. This explains yesterday's turnout. It seems the people are tired now, and most have made their peace with Ruto staying in charge. Does this mean Ruto has won? Perhaps not, because Kenya is still a democracy. Ruto will face another election in 2027. That's when people can force him to go via the ballot box.
Iraq is considering a draconian step, one that would drag the country back centuries, one that would endanger its women. The plan is to reduce the age of marriage for women. It's 18 right now, but a new bill says it should be 9. Let me repeat that for you. A new bill in Iraq wants 9-year-old girls to be married off. What explains this barbaric decision? Well, the changes are part of a larger push. Let me explain. Personal matters in Iraq are governed by a 1959 law. Personal matters are things like marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Now, you may think a 1959 law is outdated, but it's way better than the new proposal because that law, the old one, allowed courts to decide on personal issues. The new one seeks to change that. It requires couples to select a sect ahead of marriage, either Sunni or Shia. You choose a sect, and then all your issues will be decided by jurists of that sect. Not a civilian court, not a government arbitrator, but an Islamic jurist of your sect. You can see why this is a problem. Many hardline clerics in Iraq have no issue with child marriage. In fact, they promote it. Most Iraqi marriages are never registered with the government anyway. They're conducted by religious figures. A lot of them are child marriages. 28% of Iraqi girls are married before the age of 18. 22% of unregistered marriages involve brides under the age of 14. So the thinking is quite clear. Legalize all those illegal marriages. Give it a legal cover to what is already happening in the shadows. And how are the people of Iraq responding to this? Activists and women's groups are opposing it. They have held protests in major cities. They want this bill to be withdrawn, which brings us to the politics of it. You see, the 1959 law represents a different time. Iraq had just overthrown its monarchy. Left-wing ideology was gaining momentum, so the law tried to limit the role of religion. But today's Iraq is very different. It has a number of hardline Islamist parties, and they want to roll back the personal laws. One attempt was made last month. A similar bill was pushed in Iraq's parliament. But the outrage was huge. So what has changed this time? Why are they trying again? The biggest Shia coalition of Iraq is now on board. As a result, the bill is more likely to pass this time. It is still being discussed by the lawmakers. But just consider the absurdity of it. Child marriage in 2024. And it's more common than you would think. Around 20% of young women today were married before the age of 18. That's 1 in 5. The United Nations wants to eliminate this practice by 2030, but at this rate, it will take 300 years. Let me show you some data. Sub-Saharan Africa makes up 20% of all child marriages. South Asia makes up 45% of all child marriages. India alone makes up 33%. And just to be clear, child marriage is illegal in India. Yet there are so many child brides. And what does that tell you? That young girls are suffering because of outdated religious beliefs everywhere in the world. In some places it's child marriage, in some places it's inheritance, elsewhere it's abortion. Women are basically being treated as pawns. Iraqi hardliners want to burnish their Islamic credentials, so they want to legalize child marriage. Donald Trump wants to show that he's a good Christian, so he opposes abortion rights. The Taliban wants to show that they are true Islamists, so they ban women's education. I know these are vastly different examples, but the principle remains the same. Limit women's rights to prove your religious commitment. It's about time politicians stop doing that. Their little games have real-world consequences. Just consider child marriage. Girls getting married at the age of 9, these girls are more likely to experience domestic abuse, less likely to be in school, and more likely to experience health problems. No imaginary religious renaissance is worth it. Can you predict earthquakes? Well, not really. You can detect some signs, but there's no sure shot way to predict a coming quake. But Japan aims to change that. They have introduced a new system. It will warn ahead of an earthquake. And how accurate is it? Well, we don't know yet. But Japan has already issued its first warning for a mega earthquake, something with a magnitude of 8 to 9 on the Richter scale. There's a 70% probability of it striking, apparently. 70% probability. But when will this quake come? And should the world worry about this? Our next report tells you.
From 1998 to 2017, earthquakes killed over 750,000 people across the globe. That's half of all the deaths from natural disasters. Earthquakes strike suddenly. There's often no warning. But Japan has now issued one. It's the first of its kind. For the first time, Japan has warned of a megaquake. The warning says there is a risk of a huge earthquake along the Pacific coast. So much so that the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida cancelled his visit to Central Asia. He was supposed to visit Kazakhstan and Mongolia, but those trips stand cancelled. So what does this mean? Until now, there has been no system to predict earthquakes. No one can do it with surety. There are some signs like odd animal behavior or rock patterns, but nothing too concrete. In 2011, a 9.0 magnitude earthquake hit Japan. Nearly 20,000 people died. So Japan set up a new system. It's to predict if a quake is coming. This is the first such advisory from that system. So what does it say? The advisory talks about the Nankai Trough subduction zone. It's located between two tectonic plates in the Pacific Ocean. The 800-kilometer undersea trough runs from Shizuoka to the southern tip of Kyushu. It's been the site of destructive earthquakes. In 1707, all segments of the Nankai Trough ruptured at once. It led to the second most powerful earthquake on record. The warning says Japan should prepare for a possible earthquake one day that could kill hundreds of thousands of people. Japan says the magnitude could be between 8 and 9. It will be along the Nankai Trough. There's a roughly 70% probability of it happening, and it could happen in the next 30 years. So how worrying is it? In a worst-case scenario, 300,000 lives could be lost. The damages could be worth $13 trillion. Major infrastructure could be wiped out. So, should Japan start preparing? Well, there's a caveat. The warning doesn't mean it's imminent. It says that while the likelihood of an earthquake is higher than normal, there's no indication that a major earthquake will definitely occur during a specific period of time. For now, Japanese people have nothing to worry about. Tokyo has asked people living in quake zones to take necessary precautions like securing furniture or locating the nearest evacuation shelter. Households also usually keep a disaster kit. But for now, there's no need to panic. Japan has often talked about the big one, a big earthquake that could ravage the country. But while Japan's warning may sound ominous, it's not imminent.
Our next story is from the US. The country is heading for a major election. They will choose a new president this November, so you would think that the people are all fired up. They have the chance to decide their fate. They get a say on how the next 4 years will pan out. It's not something that every country can boast of, but it seems that the Americans aren't too excited about their democracy. Here's a new poll that just came out, and the findings are bleak. It says about 80% of Americans feel that their democracy is at stake. 80%. 4 out of 5 Americans feel that this democracy will crumble, depending on who wins. On the one side, you have the Democrats. They're the ones who are the most alarmed. They think that if Donald Trump wins, American democracy will die. I suppose this does make sense. After all, Trump did say that he wanted to be a dictator on day one, but he also said it would only be for one day. Despite that disclaimer, it seems Democrats haven't been reassured. Only 20% of all Democrats feel that American democracy will survive another Trump presidency. What about the Republicans, though? Well, most of them also feel that democracy won't survive. Only 24% Republicans do not fear a Kamala Harris presidency. Why is that? Well, they think the Democrats are a danger to democracy because of how Donald Trump has been treated over the last few years. He's faced a number of lawsuits. Republicans think that he is being unfairly targeted via the judicial system. And that is why they fear for democracy. And then you have the third group of American voters, the independents. They are the most pessimistic bunch. 1 in 3 independents believe that American democracy is already broken. They think that it doesn't really matter who wins. American democracy is already too far gone to save. That is the result of this new survey that's come out. Like I said, it's very bleak. And it's in complete contrast to the way that America projects itself. What do you usually think of when you hear the term USA? Perhaps the American flag comes to mind, or the bald eagle, America's democracy mascot. You can almost hear people screaming the word freedom. Well, that's how the US has always projected itself anyway. It keeps calling itself the world's oldest democracy, and it has certainly used this freedom and democracy image to justify its actions, no matter how undemocratic. Think about all the wars that America has waged in the name of democracy. Sure, a lot of these wars were fought against countries with oil deposits like Iraq and Libya and Iraq again. But that was just a coincidence, right? The US insisted that it was really about democracy. So what if these countries ended up in a worse place after the US got involved? Like Afghanistan, or Libya, or Haiti, or most of South America. Whether it's a war or CIA intervention, America always says it is working for democracy, but now its own citizens believe that democracy is dead. So what can be done? How will the US reassure its citizens that democracy really is going to be fine? Perhaps the rest of the world can help. We can follow America's own example and start sending election observers, perhaps a UN-backed monitoring team that can certify that the elections are free and fair. Maybe that would reassure American citizens. Another way to follow Washington's example is to keep commenting on everything. We can all release parliamentary reports monitoring the health of American democracy. We can keep flagging any discrepancies and issuing strongly worded messages whenever US democracy looks like it is under threat. Worst case, we can impose sanctions as a punitive measure for faltering democratic credentials. It may seem harsh, but that's how the US behaves whenever it feels that democracy anywhere else is under threat. Now that Americans feel their own democracy is failing, perhaps it's time for the rest of the world to repay the favor. Speech is silver, silence is gold. We've all heard this, but how many of us truly practice it? Well, to be fair, it is hard. We live in a world dominated by noise, whether it's honking cars, doom-scrolling reels, white noise to sleep, podcasts on your run. We are always listening to something. 1.1 billion of us are subscribed to some music streaming service or the other. Podcast streams have doubled in the last 6 years. Audiobook sales are up by 94%. So we are constantly overstimulated. The buzz around us has become a way of life, almost like an addiction. So our question tonight is this: are we overdosing? Are we subjecting ourselves to too much sound? Do we need a moment of silence? Well, here's what science says. Sound is good, but constant exposure is not healthy. And loud noise is especially bad. I guess we all knew this already. It leads to elevated heart rates, increased blood pressure, and even a flood of stress hormones. It hampers concentration, raises the risk of cardiovascular disease, even depression. So what should you do? Embrace silence. And how do you do it? Well, here's what experts say. At least one meal in the day should be consumed in silence, preferably breakfast, which does not really mean eating alone. It means eating without gadgets, focusing on your food. There is something called the crunch effect. Apparently, if you can hear yourself chewing food, you end up consuming less of it. But if that's not your thing, you could try other ways. There are lots of new trends. Silence seems to be the new hot commodity. Trust Gen Z to turn silence into a vibe too. Take silent walks, for example. It's the new favorite on TikTok. And it's as simple as it sounds. You go on a walk without headphones. You can't listen to music, podcasts, or anything else. You focus on your surroundings with your mind in the present. It's a bit like meditation, only here you're walking. Then there's something called silent travel. What does that mean? Well, a whole lot of things. Meditation retreats, digital detox cabins, or even just a night camping in the middle of nowhere. The idea is quite simple. Disconnect with the world, reconnect with yourself. It's a practice that is growing in popularity. Silent travel was named one of the top travel trends of 2024, and we get why. Endure a crying baby on a plane, and suddenly silence seems precious. But it's not new. Silence has been cherished through centuries. In Christianity, it's a form of devotion. In Hinduism, it's a form of awareness. We have something called Maun, the sacred practice of remaining silent intentionally. In Buddhism, silence is noble. It's a way to achieve inner peace. Socrates talked about listening before speaking. Silence also has cultural significance. Asian and Nordic countries value it. In Asian cultures, silence is a form of respect. In Nordic nations, it signifies careful thought. Plus, it's a psychologically powerful tool. It makes you more self-aware. It helps regulate emotions. It can also be a form of communication. Sometimes silence can convey more than words. But it's not all great. Silence doesn't always have the best reputation. It can also be seen as passive-aggressive. It could be a barrier to communication. It can be manipulative. It can also affect your mental health. Too much silence could be detrimental too. So what's the right balance? Well, for starters, understand what silence means to you. For an introvert, it's a way of life. For a dictator, it's a tool of oppression. And for a busy mother, it's 2 minutes of mental peace. Silence means different things to different people. How then do we embrace it? Well, it doesn't have to be TikTok trends or elaborate hashtags. Silence is not a novelty, really. You don't need to spend hundreds of dollars stuck in a mountain without network. There's actually a short and sweet way to do it. It's called staying quiet. In a world overrun by words, saying absolutely nothing sometimes can be a fine art. Maybe we can start with that. Sports can be heartbreaking. Sports can also be unforgiving. But when it clicks, there is no better feeling in the world. Just ask Arshad Nadeem. He's won a gold medal for Pakistan in men's javelin. Now it's mixed feelings for us because Nadeem's win took the gold away from Neeraj Chopra. Neeraj had to settle for silver and all of us were heartbroken. But then we read Nadeem's story. He was born in a small village around 300 kilometers from Lahore. His father was a construction worker, also the only breadwinner. So growing up, things were tight. At first, Nadeem tried his hand at cricket, but since everyone in the country was an aspiring cricketer, he gave up. Instead, he chose athletics. And that's how Nadeem discovered javelin. Of course, the government did not support him. In Pakistan, it's cricket or nothing. Nadeem used to practice with carved bamboo sticks initially. Even his practice javelin was almost 8 years old. So in the month of March, he released an appeal. He sought assistance to buy a new javelin. In the end, it was crowd-funded. In fact, that's how Nadeem managed most of his expenses. The villagers would pool their resources to send him for competitions, and on Thursday, all of it paid off. Nadeem won Pakistan's first ever individual gold. It was also Pakistan's first Olympic medal in 32 years. So it is a very big deal for the country. And on cue, the credit seekers crawled in. The Prime Minister, the ruling party, all of them jumped in to bask in Nadeem's glory. So Nadeem is our inspiration heading into the weekend, and Pakistan's politicians are our joke of the day. And social media is having a field day with them.
देसी शॉप है आपसे बेहतर 70 साल से चलना चाहिए सर आपका विजन है सर आपका विजन है सर एकदम इन्होंने वक्त बदल दिया जज्बात बदल दिए
it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Body cam footage shows police officers being hit by fireworks during the UK riots. A cargo ship explodes into flames at a busy port in eastern China, and giant pandas make their much-awaited public debut at the San Diego Zoo. Finally, we're taking you back in history on this day. In 1173, Italy began reconstructing the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The tower began to lean in the 12th century due to the soft ground. By 1990, the tower had tilted by 5 degrees. Since then, Italy has tried to prevent any further tilt. Today, it is one of the 7 wonders of the world. We're leaving you on that note. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend.
Across continents, one powerful news source.
Bringing you diverse perspectives on the issues that matter.
We go beyond the boundaries to give you that little extra about every sporting moment.
So thank you for making Firstpost 5 million strong. We're counting on your support, and you can trust us to bring you the news unfiltered and unvarnished.
Climate change is on our doorstep. It's time for a revolution to take root. And it starts with 1.4 billion Indians. It starts with one tree for humanity, one tree for Mother Earth, one tree for our future. Project One Tree, a News 18 network initiative.
On this today, the T20 World Cup bandwagon has moved across to the West Indies. What can you expect from this?
Hello, I'm Alison Green, coming to you from Durban, South Africa. Today we have a special show.
Start with a report on India's shifting nuclear posture. For the first time since India officially became a nuclear power.
Hello and welcome to Firstpost America. I'm Aaron Ham, coming to you live from the nation's capital,